Wagner's, interesting enough, they did pull out before the Ukrainians' counteroffensive. They were involved in Russian offensive operations, but they did not want to participate in the defense. They did not want to see their forces ground up by the Ukrainians' offensive. And they've been out for some weeks, and obviously, given the current circumstances, they're very unlikely to return in any capacity other than working for the Ministry of Defense. Secondly, they'll have quite an effect that the Ukrainians will have on the Russians in these defensive positions, on their personnel certainly, as well as their vehicles, and immobilizing them and assisting. It's not going to be decisive just by itself, certainly. A lot depends also on the Ukrainians' determination, their resolve, and their skill in using their forces appropriately on the battlefield. There's no one munition that in of itself is going to win the day, but all of it complementing each other will have quite an impact on the Russians.
All right. The US will send Ukraine a cluster munitions package to help in its counteroffensive against Russia. Now let's talk about cluster munitions. What are they? Well, they're banned by more than 100 countries. They're a class of weapon that contains multiple explosive bomblets called submunitions. Jack Keane is a retired 4-star US general who served as Vice Chief of Staff of the US Army between 1993 and 2003. General, hello and good evening. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, good evening. Delighted to be here.
Well, it's always good to have you. You know this terrain. When you heard that President Biden and his top team had agreed to send Ukraine this cluster munitions package, honestly, what was your response? What did you think?
Well, I think it's appropriate. I wish it had been provided sooner. The Ukrainians have requested it many, many months ago. The munitions that we're providing, what makes it controversial is the dud rate among the munitions. And the munitions we're providing, as opposed to the Russians who are using the same type of munitions, their dud rate is somewhere around 30 to 40%.
And when you say dud rate, that's the failure rate, is that right?
Yes. The failure rate on your munition to explode, it explodes in the air, and then the bomblets are let out. And if there's dud rates among the bomblets, then it could be dangerous for somebody walking or traveling in a vehicle subsequent to that munition being on the ground, weeks or months or years later, and suffering an injury, which has happened in the past. The United States has produced weapons who have a dud rate very close to 1% with a high of around 2.5%, and that is what the Ukrainians will be receiving. What is happening here is the consumption of normal artillery ammunition is being consumed at an extraordinary rate. The United States and our coalition partners throughout Europe are providing over 120,000 of these rounds a month, but they are being consumed, and the Ukrainians are very concerned about that, particularly now that their counteroffensive is underway. And that is why they've been pressuring the United States to provide the cluster munitions, is to make up for this shortage that is coming. And I do think it's the appropriate thing. The Ukrainians know full well a couple of realities. One, that they're trying to end this war as quickly as possible and drive the Russians out of their terrain. Two, they know full well if they're not able to succeed in this counteroffensive, the war will be protracted. And by definition, that means not only more casualties to their troops, but more casualties to the civilian population. We can see the Russians attacking every single day civilian apartments in major cities and other domiciles throughout Ukraine, making war on the Ukrainian people. So that is what is driving the Ukrainians. Let's end this war as soon as possible.
And if it's as clear-cut as you say, someone needs to tell some leading Democrats, because they're very concerned about this. I'm talking about people like Representative Betty McCollum. She's a Democrat, and she has called this decision by the Biden administration to transfer these cluster munitions to Ukraine unnecessary and a terrible mistake. She went on to say, the legacy of cluster bombs is misery, death, and expensive cleanup generations after their use. So perhaps she and her colleagues simply don't understand that the failure rate is much lower and fewer people will be killed in the long run, even if more Russians are killed now, because that's the objective, to drive them out in this counteroffensive.
Yeah, that's true. And a couple of other realities. There's thousands and thousands of Russian mines that are buried throughout Ukraine. And Ukraine has asked for assistance in demining them. The farmers have asked for assistance because they can't go into these fields without getting hurt themselves. They're not visible, they're buried. And the reality is the United States is spending over $90 million just on the demining of Russian mines throughout Ukraine that have been there for the last 18 months. And that's the flip side to this issue as well. And we also used these cluster bombs in 2001 in Afghanistan at the beginning of the war. We stopped it after the Taliban was toppled. And we did it in Iraq also in 2003, and we stopped it after Saddam Hussein regime was toppled, and did not continue it for the rest of the war. I just want our audience to know what our previous participation was.
Well, indeed, it's important to know the context, and of course the fact that 120 countries have banned them. But what impact do you think effective use of them will have on the Russian presence in eastern Ukraine, particularly during this counteroffensive, and also given that it would appear that the Wagner presence isn't as it was?
Well, the Wagners, interesting enough, they did pull out before the Ukrainians' counteroffensive. They were involved in Russian offensive operations, but they did not want to participate in the defense. They did not want to see their forces ground up by the Ukrainians' offensive. And they've been out for some weeks, and obviously, given the current circumstances, they're very unlikely to return in any capacity other than working for the Ministry of Defense. Secondly, they'll have quite an effect that the Ukrainians will have on the Russians in these defensive positions, on their personnel certainly, as well as their vehicles, and immobilizing them and assisting. It's not going to be decisive just by itself, certainly. A lot depends also on the Ukrainians' determination, their resolve, and their skill in using their forces appropriately on the battlefield. There's no one munition that in of itself is going to win the day, but all of it complementing each other will have quite an impact on the Russians.
All right. General Jack Keane, thank you